The story begins with a mysterious mountain-like structure suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Ryouji, a high school student, reflects on the strangeness of a dungeon manifesting in modern Japan, questioning its existence. Ryouji recognizes the dungeon, saying, "I've seen this dungeon before." He cautiously steps inside, descending into the eerie, dimly lit stairway. A flashback begins. 2 weeks ago, Ryouji explains how he fell into a mysterious hole that transported him to another world. Upon awakening, he finds himself in a fantasy kingdom facing an apocalyptic threat. The king and princess plead with the protagonist to save their world. The princess, smiling warmly, says, "Please save this world." The princess explains that their world is under the threat of destruction caused by the rise of dungeons and monsters. She reveals that they summoned him as a hero to aid them. Our protagonist is unsure about taking up the task, expressing his unwillingness to get involved. The princess emotionally appeals to him, offering him a typical beautiful isekai proposal. After some hesitation, our protagonist takes on the role of a dungeon-clearing hero. He encounters and begins battling monsters, stabbing and defeating them with determination. Ryouji defeats a large monster and reflects on the offer made by the princess. He learns that clearing the dungeon will grant him rewards like magic stones and the possibility of returning home. Despite his inner doubts, Ryouji resolves to continue clearing the dungeon. He stands over the defeated enemy, physically and morally exhausted, but determined to go on. Ryouji fights against a group of monsters, stabbing and defeating them one by one. He decides to defeat the Demon King to find a way back home, but notes that if he doesn't succeed, he might not be able to return to his original world. Ryouji heals himself using magic after a tough battle. The princess appears and asks if it's safe for him to be exploring alone. She expresses concern for his well-being and acknowledges his efforts in fighting. The princess thanks Ryouji for his hard work and offers to support him further. She reassures him that his sacrifices are meaningful and that she'll continue to help him achieve his goals. 1 year later, our protagonist successfully completes his first dungeon. He stands triumphantly, exhausted but smiling, declaring the dungeon cleared. The princess congratulates him and acknowledges how far he's come, hinting at his growing strength and potential. The princess notes that our protagonist has grown much stronger and more capable over time. She admits that she didn't initially expect him to make it this far, but is proud of his progress. Our protagonist appears grateful, but still focused on his goal of returning home. 6 months later, Ryouji completes his second dungeon by defeating a massive monster. He reflects on his progress, noting that his skills have significantly improved. The princess offers to train him further, giving him advice on using potions and other tools to prepare for future challenges. The princess explains that defeating the Demon King will cause all dungeons to disappear, setting the world back to normal. Ryouji shows determination to complete his mission, and the princess advises him on using potions wisely for survival. The two continue their journey, walking toward the next challenge. 5 years later, Ryouji faces a massive dragon in a dungeon. The intense battle nearly ends in disaster, but Ryouji narrowly escapes harm with the help of the princess. He reflects on how far he's come, realizing he's still alive thanks to her support. The princess taps Ryouji on the shoulder and reassures him with a smile, saying she's proud of him. She promises to wait for him at the castle once his journey is over. Ryouji acknowledges his progress and vows to finish the mission. Ryouji finally defeats the Demon King after years of struggle. He reflects on the countless times he almost died, but persevered to complete his mission. With the Demon King defeated, the dungeons and monsters are no longer a threat. Back at the castle, Ryouji meets the king and the princess, who is now in royal attire. Ryouji expresses his desire to return to his original world, surprising the princess. Despite her emotional reaction, he remains firm about going back home. The princess becomes emotional, trying to hold back her tears, but ultimately breaks down. Ryouji tells the princess to take care of herself and wishes her well. As the princess activates the magic circle to return Ryouji home, she reassures him and says goodbye. Ryouji returns to modern Japan, finding himself back in the familiar streets of his world. He reflects on his journey and how it all ended, now ready to move on with his life. Ryouji resumes his normal life, encountering people from his past. Suddenly, Ryouji is approached by his childhood friend Yoko, asking if he remembers her. Confused, he asks, "Who are you?" The girl expresses frustration, saying, "Enough! How long are you going to make me wait?" Ryouji's internal monologue reveals that he has been away for 10 years and wonders how others might view him after such a long absence. Ryouji stands in front of a house labeled Furutani, his old home. He reflects on finally returning home after 10 years. His mother greets him warmly, surprised at how much he has grown. She prepares tea for him, trying to make him feel comfortable. Ryouji and his mother sit down for tea. She tells him about the changes in their lives while he was away. He mentions wanting to return to school, where he left off 10 years ago. His determined expression shows he's ready to reintegrate into the normal world. Ryouji explores the city and takes in the sights, reflecting on how much has changed. He mentions that the world feels real but distant after his absence. He smiles, thinking to himself, "I'm so glad to be back." The scene shifts to a hospital room where Ryouji is standing by a covered stretcher. He notices something strange and begins to question, "Isn't there something wrong?" The stretcher is revealed to contain the body of someone who died in a car crash. The crash is depicted in detail, showing a heavily damaged vehicle that collided with a truck. Ryouji realizes, to his horror, that the bodies under the sheet are his parents. He begins to panic, overwhelmed by the devastating reality. At the funeral, Ryouji sits in silence while others mourn. His internal monologue reveals his struggle to process the situation. He wonders if this is some cruel nightmare or a horrible joke. Afterward, a relative approaches him, explaining that he must now live with them. Ryouji, staring into the distance, feels lost and overwhelmed by the sudden loss of his parents and the familiar world he had just returned to. Later, Ryouji visits the altar displaying his parents' photos. He lights incense and pays his respects, reflecting deeply on their passing. Sadness washes over him as he acknowledges the cruel irony. After years of fighting to defeat the Demon King in another world, he returned only to face this personal tragedy. He struggles to reconcile his experiences with his new reality. While he's at the altar, Ryouji hears approaching footsteps. Turning, he sees his uncle and several other relatives arriving. His uncle greets him with an unsettling tone, saying, "Oh, Ryouji, it's a lot to take in, isn't it?" The relatives appear suspicious and overbearing, some dressed in flashy and eccentric clothing. Ryouji feels wary and confused by their demeanor. His aunt and uncle soon reveal their true intentions. They are fixated on money and inheritance. The aunt points out that Ryouji now owns his parents' assets, but as a minor, cannot manage them himself. She proposes they take control of everything, insisting, "We'll take care of it for you." She goes further, subtly threatening him by suggesting he could be sent to a child welfare center if he doesn't comply. Shocked, Ryouji questions their motives and their audacity. The situation escalates as the relatives laugh coldly, exposing their greed and lack of empathy. They demand he hand over his parents' money, property, and valuables. One relative ominously adds, "You wouldn't want to make this harder than it needs to be." Ryouji, standing his ground, begins to question what kind of people they really are. He realizes these individuals aren't family in the true sense, but opportunists trying to exploit him. He reflects on the absurdity of the situation, wondering if it's some twisted joke. As the relatives' greed intensifies, so does Ryouji's determination to protect his parents' legacy. The relatives mock him, with one boasting about their importance and connections. They belittle him, assuming he's powerless. Calmly, Ryouji responds, calling them out for their selfishness and greed. Enraged, the relatives order their henchmen to teach him a lesson. The henchmen surround Ryouji, taunting him as a scared little kid. They crack their knuckles, attempting to intimidate him. Ryouji, however, remains calm, analyzing their movements. He reflects on his extensive combat experience in the other world, realizing these petty thugs are no match for him. One henchman throws a punch, but Ryouji effortlessly dodges it. With precise movements, he counters and incapacitates the attackers with ease. The relatives and their hired muscle are stunned by his unexpected skill and composure. Ryouji's confidence and strength leave them speechless, forcing them to rethink their approach. Ryouji silently walks past the group, exuding an aura of quiet dominance. The remaining henchmen hesitate but attempt to grab him. With almost no effort, Ryouji evades their attacks, maintaining his calm demeanor while controlling the chaotic situation. Ryouji steps forward confidently, explaining that the henchmen's movements are slow and predictable compared to the enemies he faced in the other world. His cold, authoritative tone warns them not to underestimate him. The greedy relatives and their hired thugs freeze in fear, realizing they've made a grave mistake. Ryouji demands they stay still and not attempt anything foolish, ending the confrontation firmly on his terms. Despite his warning, the henchmen attempt another attack, but Ryouji swiftly overwhelms them. With precise counters and powerful strikes, he incapacitates them effortlessly. The relatives, stunned by the commotion, weakly ask if everyone is okay, not out of genuine concern, but out of nervousness. Ryouji, calm and composed, reassures them that the situation is under control. Ryouji activates a skill called hypnosis, using it to gain control over his greedy relatives. Under his influence, they become docile and compliant, their scheming replaced with complete obedience. He commands them to kneel, and they obey without resistance, allowing Ryouji to assert dominance and make them listen to his instructions without objection. He questions their actions, asking whether they're truly thinking about their futures or acting purely out of greed. One uncle arrogantly dismisses his words, claiming to be smart, but Ryouji remains unimpressed. Using his hypnosis skill, he further subdues them, ensuring they follow his every command. To resolve the situation, Ryouji demands they return everything they've taken. Under his influence, the relatives willingly hand over all the money, property deeds, and valuables they had schemed to claim for themselves. Ryouji reinforces their compliance with his skill, remarking on how easily they succumbed due to their weak mental resistance. Once the immediate conflict is resolved, Ryouji calmly watches as his relatives, still under hypnosis, thank him profusely and pledge to write letters of apology for their behavior. They agree to leave him alone moving forward. Satisfied, Ryouji ensures they leave peacefully. As the relatives depart the house, now behaving politely and respectfully, Ryouji reflects on the absurdity of the situation. Still, he feels relieved to have handled the problem effectively. Free from their interference, he begins to plan his next steps. Later, Ryouji oversees the transfer of his parents' assets back to his control. As he kneels in front of his parents' altar, he acknowledges the greed that ultimately led to his relatives' downfall. Alone, he questions whether he made the right choices and wonders if life would have been different had his parents survived. Grief overwhelms him, and for the first time since returning, he cries openly in front of his parents' ashes. Regret and guilt consume him as he questions whether his presence could have prevented their deaths. A few weeks later, Ryouji is seen walking with his childhood friend, Yoko. They discuss the strange changes happening in the world, including the sudden appearance of dungeons filled with monsters. Yoko explains that these dungeons are emerging globally, creating chaos while also attracting adventurers. Ryouji listens carefully, realizing the significance of this phenomenon. Yoko continues, theorizing that the depletion of magic in other worlds could be linked to the spread of magic and monsters in their own. Ryouji agrees, noting that the flow of magic between worlds could explain the sudden shifts. Together, they discuss the potential dangers and opportunities this new reality presents. Determined to protect the world from whatever threats lie ahead, Ryouji decides to investigate further. Yoko mentions rumors of people forming guilds and governments attempting to regulate dungeon exploration. Their conversation ends as they arrive at the foot of a mysterious mountain marked with a "Keep Out" sign. The final scene reveals a foreboding dungeon entrance. Ryouji gazes at it with resolve, ready to face whatever challenges await.